Recent reporting says shipping traffic at the Strait of Hormuz fell below its monthly average, while the United States and Iran made competing claims over control. That establishes a reported reduction in traffic, but it does not establish exclusive control by either side. So the immediate question is not simply who claims control, but what can be measured regardless of who is right. The cited evidence reports roughly 20 million barrels per day of oil moving through Hormuz, representing about 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. Available crude pipeline bypass capacity is only about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, far below normal Hormuz oil flows. That comparison identifies the bypass gap. Alternative routes can carry some flow, but their documented capacity is substantially smaller than the normal movement through the strait. This is why Hormuz still matters in the evidence, not because competing claims are settled, but because the measured substitute capacity is limited. The comparison also limits the argument, because it concerns operational capacity rather than intent, future prices, or how long disruption might continue. In other words, reduced traffic and conflicting control claims describe the event, while the flow figures explain why the choke point can retain leverage. The event is real enough to examine, but the decisive issue is the physical capacity scale behind the claims. Hormuz matters because roughly 20 million barrels per day moved through it, representing about 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. The bypass is smaller. Available crude pipeline capacity is only about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. So alternative routes can reduce disruption but cannot replace Hormuz at equivalent scale. The question is whether control claims or route capacity better explains the strait's leverage. This episode tests that question by comparing normal flow with bypass capacity, then separating that measurement from claims about outcomes. The first evidence layer is the scale of ordinary movement through the strait. EIA reports that total oil flows through the strait averaged 20.9 million barrels per day in the first half of 2025. The IEA separately states that 20 million barrels per day, around 25% of world seaborne oil trade, transits the strait. Those figures establish why the route matters, but they do not by themselves establish intent, prices, or how long disruption continues. The second evidence layer is the physical capacity of alternative routes. EIA says the Saudi East-West pipeline and the UAE Abu Dhabi pipeline together could provide about 4.7 million barrels per day to bypass the strait. The IEA estimates 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of available capacity to export crude from the Gulf on alternative routes. Read together, these figures show a capacity gap rather than a complete absence of alternatives. That distinction matters because a partial bypass can cushion disruption while leaving normal Hormuz flows without an equivalent route. The thesis is therefore qualified. Leverage persists because the bypass is smaller, not because every disruption produces the same outcome. Hormuz still matters because roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through it each day, representing about 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. The documented bypass capacity is only about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, far below normal Hormuz oil flows. That difference is the bypass gap. Alternatives can reduce disruption, but they cannot replace the strait at equivalent scale. The first evidence layer is the volume, normally using the choke point, not a claim about political intent or future prices. In the first half of 2025, total oil flows through the strait averaged 20.9 million barrels per day, equivalent to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. A separate energy fact sheet describes the flow as 20 million barrels per day, around 25% of world seaborne oil trade. Together, those measures establish why the route is significant. Its importance is visible in the amount of oil passing through it. The second evidence layer is the capacity of routes that could bypass the strait. Saudi Aramco's East-West crude oil pipeline and the UAE's Abu Dhabi pipeline together could provide about 4.7 million barrels per day of bypass capacity. The International Energy Agency estimates 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of available capacity to export crude from the Gulf on alternative routes. The range varies, but either endpoint remains well below the roughly 20 million barrels per day associated with normal strait traffic. The EIA states that if the strait were closed, existing alternatives could move only a portion of the oil volumes out of the strait. The IEA likewise says available capacity on alternative export routes is limited, with operational crude pipelines that could potentially reroute flows through only Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is the mechanism behind the framework. The workaround is real, yet its measured capacity is smaller than the flow it would need to replace. Think of Hormuz as a wide main pipeline feeding a system whose detours are narrower side pipes. The side pipes can keep some flow moving, but they cannot carry the original volume documented for the main route. The analogy clarifies capacity, not history, intent, prices, or whether disruption will continue. So the key question is not whether any alternative exists, but whether it can carry enough of the original volume to function as an equivalent substitute. The evidence answers that question narrowly. Alternatives cushion disruption, while the documented gap leaves normal Hormuz flows without an equivalent route. That conclusion does not require treating the bypass as useless, because moving a portion is different from replacing everything, nor does it require assuming identical outcomes every time, because the figures describe capacity rather than the full consequences of a disruption. What they do establish is a structural constraint. The main flow is much larger than the documented alternative route capacity. In that limited, measurable sense, Hormuz retains leverage even when claims about control or traffic conflict. The framework is therefore simple. Compare normal chokepoint volume with maximum documented bypass capacity before drawing broader conclusions. With that framework established, the episode can compare evidence without treating a partial workaround as a full replacement. Hormuz still matters because the oil moving through it is much greater than the crude volume documented on available bypass routes. Roughly 20 million barrels per day of oil moved through Hormuz, representing about 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. Only about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of crude pipeline bypass capacity was available, far below normal Hormuz oil flows. The gap between normal strait flows and bypass capacity means alternative routes reduce disruption but cannot replace Hormuz at equivalent scale. That is the central measurement. Not whether an alternative exists, but how much of the original flow it can actually accommodate. A useful picture is a broad main pipeline connected to detours with much narrower capacity. The side pipes can keep some flow moving, but the documented numbers do not show them carrying the original volume. The EIA records that oil flows through the strait averaged 20.9 million barrels per day in the first half of 2025. The IEA separately describes 20 million barrels per day, around 1/4 of world seaborne oil trade, transiting the strait. The two official descriptions use slightly different wording, but they point to the same order of magnitude for normal traffic. Available capacity to export Gulf crude on alternative routes is estimated by the IEA at 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. The EIA says Saudi Aramco's east-west crude oil pipeline and the UAE's Abu Dhabi pipeline together could provide about 4.7 million barrels per day. Subtracting the bypass range from normal strait flows leaves a large uncovered portion even before making claims about prices or intent. The EIA states that existing alternatives could move only a portion of the oil volumes out of the strait if it were closed. The IEA says available capacity on alternative export routes is limited, with only Saudi Arabia and the UAE having operational crude pipelines that could potentially bypass Hormuz. So the strongest opposing explanation is partly right. Alternatives can cushion a disruption, and that matters operationally. But cushioning is not equivalent replacement because the measured capacity gap remains substantial in the supplied energy evidence. This is an operational analogy, not a historical comparison, and it does not establish intent or predict prices. It only clarifies why a narrower detour can preserve some movement without removing the importance of the main route. The International Maritime Organization says transit passage through straits used for international navigation should not be threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended. The IMO Council stressed that transit passage through straits used for international navigation should not be threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended, that maritime evidence concerns navigation, while the separate pipeline figures answer the physical capacity question. In other words, a rule supporting passage is not the same thing as infrastructure capable of carrying equivalent oil volumes. The IMO reports that about 20,000 seafarers and maritime workers are affected by the regional shipping crisis. That figure includes seafarers, port workers, and offshore crews impacted in the region. This worker count should remain separate from the oil flow calculation. It describes human impact, not additional evidence about pipeline capacity. Taken together, the evidence supports a limited conclusion. Bypasses provide adaptation, while the scale gap preserves Hormuz's leverage. The first evidence layer therefore establishes physical constraint. The next layer asks how adaptation and uncertainty modify it. Hormuz still matters because roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through it per day, while bypass pipelines could carry only a fraction of that flow. About 20 million barrels per day pass through Hormuz, representing roughly 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. Available crude pipeline bypass capacity was estimated at about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. That difference means alternative routes can reduce disruption but cannot replace Hormuz at an equivalent scale. For comparison, picture a broad primary pipe whose available side routes are markedly narrower. The side pipes can keep some flow moving, yet their documented capacity leaves a measurable gap rather than a complete substitute. The useful comparison is therefore about scale. One route carries far more than the alternatives are documented to handle. That is why the evidence supports adaptation and continued leverage at the same time, without requiring either extreme conclusion. This analogy is deliberately limited. It clarifies an operational capacity gap, not a historical precedent. It does not establish intent, predict prices, or prove that disruption will continue. It only makes the documented difference between normal flows and available detours easier to see. The International Energy Agency estimated 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of available capacity on alternative routes. The U.S. Energy Information Administration identified about 4.7 million barrels per day from two bypass pipelines together. Against that, the International Energy Agency described 20 million barrels per day transiting the strait. The Energy Information Administration says existing alternatives could move only a portion of the oil volumes out of the strait. Those figures form the first evidence layer. Physical routing limits constrain how much substitution is possible. The calculation does not say that every barrel stops, only that the documented detours cannot carry the original volume. That distinction matters because a partial workaround can cushion disruption while leaving the choke point strategically important. In other words, adaptation changes the severity of the constraint, but does not erase the constraint documented by these figures. The second evidence layer shifts from physical capacity to the stated principle governing transit through international straits. The International Maritime Organization stressed that transit passage through straits used for international navigation should not be threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended. The organization says transit passage should not be threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended. That principle describes the status of transit rights, but it does not demonstrate that normal traffic is guaranteed, nor does it alter the arithmetic. A stated right to transit and a limited ability to reroute are different kinds of evidence. The framework survives this shift because the institutional statement adds context without resolving the capacity gap. Together, the layers support a limited conclusion. Rules address transit, while infrastructure determines how much oil alternative routes can carry. That conclusion is narrower than saying Hormuz always controls outcomes, because the supplied evidence measures flows and capacity rather than political intent. It is also narrower than saying a transit principle guarantees uninterrupted movement, because the maritime statement does not make that guarantee. The strongest opposing explanation is that bypasses provide enough adaptation to make the choke point less consequential. The response is not to dismiss that explanation, but to compare its implied scale with the documented bypass range. On the supplied numbers, the alternatives cushion the system without matching the normal volume that moved through Hormuz. The comparison is useful only if its limit is clear. It describes capacity, not historical destiny or political intent. In my assessment, the documented export rebound shows partial adaptation, while the remaining shortfall keeps full replacement unproven. The IEA reports that total Gulf oil exports reached 16.1 million barrels per day in June, including volumes bypassing the strait. That June total remained below the 24 million barrels per day average reported before the war started. June Gulf exports, including bypass volumes, reached 16.1 million barrels per day, but remained below the IEA's reported pre-war level. This is the central test for the bypass argument, because recovery and replacement are not the same measurement. A rising export total can show that the system is adapting while still leaving the original route unusually important. The useful question is therefore not whether bypasses exist, but how close their combined flow comes to the earlier benchmark. The same framework treats Hormuz as the broad route and the documented alternatives as narrower side routes. The side routes can keep a portion of the oil moving, yet their available capacity remains below the flow associated with Hormuz. That analogy clarifies the documented capacity comparison only. It does not establish intent, predict prices, or prove that disruption will continue. The EIA reports that disruptions led international buyers to seek alternative petroleum product supply sources. The same report says those shifts drove up United States refinery margins, production, and exports. This is evidence of substitution behavior, but it is not evidence that alternative sources fully replace the disrupted flow. Buyer movement can cushion a disruption by redirecting demand, while the export comparison measures how much supply actually moved. Together, these facts separate two ideas that are often merged: adaptation in the market and restoration of the earlier transport scale. The first is visible in buyer behavior, while the second remains limited by the difference between 16.1 and 24 million barrels per day. That distinction matters because active adaptation can coexist with a documented capacity gap. In practical terms, alternatives may reduce the immediate effect of disruption, but the documented numbers do not show complete replacement. This is why the bypass gap remains a capacity argument rather than a claim that every shipment must stop. Before interpreting vessel counts, the EIA warns that AIS signal data around the strait have become especially unreliable since the end of February 2026. The EIA also says AIS signal data around Hormuz have become especially unreliable, so current vessel counts require extra caution. That warning changes how the traffic evidence should be read. A count is not automatically a complete record of movement. A weak signal can make apparent traffic reductions look more precise than the underlying measurement allows. So the argument should not rest on a single vessel count snapshot, especially when the measurement system itself is unstable. The strongest case combines the imperfect traffic signal with the reported export scale, rather than treating either one as conclusive alone. Current reporting describes strait traffic falling below the monthly average toward the end of the week. That report attributes the situation to volatile sentiment between the United States and Iran, alongside competing claims over control. The reporting therefore describes reduced traffic with competing control claims, rather than proving exclusive control by either side. That qualifier is important because reduced traffic does not by itself identify who controls the route or why every movement changed. It also prevents a common analytical shortcut, turning an observed slowdown into a definitive claim about exclusive control. The institutional evidence points in both directions at once. Traffic is reported as lower, while the data used to count it require caution. That combination does not erase the bypass gap. It tells us to measure the gap with more care. Buyer substitution and export recovery show resilience, but the June total still sits below the earlier flow benchmark. Meanwhile, lower reported traffic supports disruption as an observable condition, but the unreliable AIS record limits confidence in its exact size. Taken together, the evidence supports a measured conclusion. The system can adapt, yet the route retains importance because adaptation has not matched the documented prior scale. The fair opposing explanation is that alternatives and buyer responses can soften the shock, and the evidence does support that part. The limit is that cushioning is not the same as full replacement, while current traffic claims remain qualified by measurement and control uncertainty. Adaptation changes the severity and timing of a shock, but the evidence still requires comparison with the pre-disruption scale. Hormuz still matters because the available bypass capacity is far below normal, flows through the strait. Alternative routes can reduce disruption, but they cannot replace Hormuz at equivalent scale. But that conclusion should not erase the strongest counter-argument. Detours and alternative supply can cushion the shock, and the system has shown adaptation. June Gulf exports, including bypass volumes, surged to 16.1 million barrels per day. The June rebound shows total Gulf exports, including bypass volumes, recovered while remaining below the IEA's reported pre-war level. The disruptions also pushed international buyers toward alternative petroleum supply sources. The disruptions also drove up United States refinery margins, production, and exports as international buyers sought alternative petroleum supplies. Together, these facts support a narrower and more defensible adaptation argument. The system can redirect some supply and absorb part of the shock. However, the June total remained well below the 24 million barrels per day average before the war started. The International Energy Agency estimates only 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of available crude capacity on alternative routes. The United Arab Emirates pipeline and Saudi Aramco's east-west crude oil pipeline together could provide about 4.7 million barrels per day. The United States Energy Information Administration says existing alternatives could move only a portion of the oil volumes out of the strait. The International Energy Agency likewise describes alternative export capacity as limited, with operational crude pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This is the key distinction. Cushioning a shock is a smaller claim than replacing the choke point. In my assessment, that rebound shows adaptation matters without proving alternative routes can replace the strait at equivalent scale. Exports recovered strongly, yet recovery did not return them to the earlier reported level. Buyer adaptation can therefore change the severity of disruption without demonstrating full replacement of normal strait flows. The operational analogy is a wide main pipeline feeding narrower side pipes. Side pipes keep some flow moving but cannot carry the original volume. That analogy clarifies capacity, not intent, future prices, or whether disruption continues. So the opposing explanation wins on one important question. It explains why a disruption can be cushioned rather than total. It does not, on these measurements, show that alternative routes can match the scale associated with normal Hormuz flows. The adaptation argument is substantial, but it changes the expected degree of disruption more readily than it erases the capacity gap. That distinction matters because resilience against complete stoppage is not the same as restoring ordinary throughput across the whole system. In my assessment, adaptation can cushion part of the shock without showing that alternative routes can replace the normal Hormuz flow described in the available capacity evidence, which keeps cushioning distinct from equivalent replacement. Hormuz still matters because reduced traffic and competing control claims do not answer the more measurable question: how much flow can actually bypass the strait? Roughly 20 million barrels of oil moved through Hormuz each day, about 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. Available crude pipeline bypass capacity was only about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, far below normal Hormuz oil flows. That difference is the bypass gap. Alternative routes can reduce disruption, but they cannot replace Hormuz at equivalent scale. Current reporting describes traffic falling below the monthly average, while the United States and Iran make competing claims over control. But current vessel counts require caution because EIA says AIS signal data around Hormuz have become especially unreliable. Taken together, those points separate two questions that are often compressed into one: who claims control and how much oil the system can move. The capacity figures provide the firmer test because they compare normal flow with documented alternatives rather than relying on a single traffic estimate. The EIA estimates that Saudi Aramco's east-west pipeline and the UAE's Abu Dhabi pipeline together could bypass about 4.7 million barrels per day. The IEA places available crude export capacity on alternative Gulf routes at about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. The EIA says that if the strait were closed, existing alternatives could move only a portion of the oil volumes out of the strait. This does not mean every barrel stops or that disruption must continue. It means the detours cushion the shock without matching the original channel's scale. The recovery data show that cushioning is real. June Gulf exports, including bypass volumes, reached 16.1 million barrels per day. Even so, that June total remained below the pre-war level reported by the IEA. So the strongest opposing explanation wins part of the argument. Supply can adapt and recover, but recovery does not erase the measured capacity gap. Competing control claims may explain why the immediate picture is contested, but they do not by themselves demonstrate that alternative routes can carry normal Hormuz volumes. Likewise, lower observed traffic is informative but incomplete when the underlying tracking data are unusually unreliable. The combined evidence therefore shifts attention from a binary control claim to a system constraint. Normal flows are much larger than available bypass capacity. A careful assessment must hold both facts at once. Exports recovered substantially, while measurement quality and the level of normal flow remain important limits. Hormuz retains strategic leverage in this evidence because alternatives can moderate disruption without providing an equivalent replacement. The conclusion is conditional. Watch the gap between normal flow and bypass capacity, and watch the quality of the measurements, not just the loudest control claim. Hormuz still matters because Gulf exports recovered to 16.1 million barrels per day, yet remained below the earlier pre-war level reported by the IEA. International buyers sought alternative petroleum supply sources during the disruptions. That gap is the measurable issue, not whether some flow continues, but whether bypasses approach the volume associated with the earlier benchmark. Over the next reporting cycle, watch whether official data still show alternative route crude capacity far below normal Hormuz oil flows. The second signal is measurement quality. EIA says AIS signal data for ships transiting Hormuz have become especially unreliable. Current reporting describes traffic falling below the monthly average, while the United States and Iran made competing claims over control. So vessel counts should not carry more certainty than the data allow. A reported decline and an uncertain signal can exist together. In the near term, the traffic interpretation would weaken if AIS reliability remained poor while vessel count conclusions continued to depend on it. The IMO says transit passage through straits used for international navigation should not be threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended. The IMO also reports that around 20,000 seafarers, port workers, and offshore crews are affected in the region. These institutional and human indicators add context. Operational conditions are not measured by traffic alone, and transit rights remain a separate public standard. In the next published IMO updates, watch whether transit passage is described as threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended. Taken together, the tests keep the conclusion conditional. Alternative sources matter, recovered exports matter, and unreliable traffic data limits confidence. Across near-term energy reports, test whether documented alternative route volumes remain only a portion of normal Hormuz oil flows. The observable evidence therefore spans supply adaptation, shipping conditions, transit rights, and the workers affected by the regional crisis. These tests do not promise a particular outcome. They show how to update the analysis as public evidence changes. Hormuz still matters because normal oil flows were far larger than the documented capacity of alternative pipelines. Roughly 20 million barrels per day moved through Hormuz, representing about 1/4 of seaborne oil trade. The reported crude pipeline bypass range was about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, substantially below normal Hormuz oil flows. June Gulf exports recovered to 16.1 million barrels per day, including bypass volumes, but remained below the pre-war level reported by the IEA. The disruptions pushed international buyers toward alternative petroleum supply sources. According to the International Maritime Organization, transit passage through straits used for international navigation should not be threatened, impeded, denied, hampered, impaired, or suspended. The EIA says current vessel counts require caution because AIS signal data around Hormuz have become especially unreliable. The strongest current reporting describes reduced traffic alongside competing control claims rather than proving exclusive control by either side. Please compare the EIA, IEA, IMO, and Reuters material directly, separating each observation from this episode's synthesis. The bypass gap is an interpretation of measured flow and capacity. Hormuz still matters because available bypass capacity is far below normal Hormuz oil flows. The estimated capacity on alternative routes is only 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. Those alternatives could move only a portion of the oil volumes out of the strait. Available capacity is limited with operational crude pipelines that could potentially bypass Hormuz in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The reasoning is therefore a capacity comparison. Detours can reduce disruption, but they cannot replace Hormuz at equivalent scale. Including bypass volumes, June Gulf exports reached 16.1 million barrels per day, but stayed below the pre-war level cited by the IEA. EIA says AIS signal data around Hormuz have become especially unreliable. That combination supports a measured conclusion. Flow recovery matters, while vessel signals alone should not settle the question. So Hormuz's leverage is not a permanent verdict about control. it is an interpretation that can change with reliable capacity and export measurements. The open question is precise. How much recovery would materially narrow the bypass gap enough to change that strategic meaning?